Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. This is something new today. We wanted to provide additional education to you in a different manner than what some of you might be used to, but we have a different format. My name is Jeff Edwards, and we have with us also Jeremiah Vardaman from UW Extension and Caitlin Youngquist, also from UW Extension. We are broadcasting from 4 different places in the state. Our technical person is Jenny Thompson, who is supporting us as well. She's in Laramie. I'm in Lingle. Jeremiah is in Powell. And Caitlin is in Worland. So we have a whole bunch of different things going on, and we will try to get to our program. Today's topic is soils and composting, I believe. Right, Caitlin?
You're muted, Caitlin.
You're muted.
Jenny, I think you need to unmute Caitlin.
Thank you. I couldn't do it myself.
That's helpful.
Yes, we're going to talk about soil today and compost and getting all that good organic matter into your soil for a beautiful garden.
Fantastic. So, Jeremiah, is there anything else that you would like to add this morning as we get going?
Well, no, just this is our first trial run with this. I'm pretty excited to try and share with everyone. And this is also going to be recorded, right, and shared as well. So if you didn't get a chance, or if people you know didn't get a chance to catch us live, catch us in the recording. But, you know, this is a good start to the year, April 1st. We're not too late, I don't think, for taking care of our soil. Are we, Caitlin?
Nope, it's a great time to get started, actually. So we have plenty of time yet to build some organic matter in our soil before the growing season.
So how do you want to start, Caitlin? We'll just kind of turn the floor over to you and interject where we think is appropriate.
Oh, that's good. It might be a little risky, but here we go. I guess the things that I'd like to tell folks as soil managers, so whether you're a gardener or a farmer or both, you're also a soil manager, and it's just really important to remember that your soil is a living system. So you're talking about the microorganisms that live in your soil, the earthworms, all the critters, the plant roots, and really remembering that our soil is a living system, and how do we increase the amount of organic matter, particularly for productive, healthy soils. And there are a lot of ways to do that. You can add compost, using mulch.
So traditionally, our soils in Wyoming are not heavy in organic matter, correct?
Correct. Most of our native soils are relatively low in organic matter. And so again, as soil managers or as gardeners, finding creative ways to add organic matter over time, and to do that with minimal disturbance to the soil is the idea.
Okay. We also have, I'm sorry if
I was going to say I have pictures at some point if you'd like me to do that.
Okay. We also pH is really important for soil types and the accessibility of nutrients. So can you describe for us Wyoming's a diverse place. Can you describe to us some of the different soil types that we're going to run across in Wyoming?
Yeah, so the world of soil classification is a large and complex world that is probably more information about soil classification than most of us need to know. But what we do need to know about our own soil is most of the soil texture and maybe some of the challenges we have. So if we have a really sandy soil, which you'll be able to tell because it's gritty and feels sandy, or a heavy clay soil, which is the type of soil that sticks to your boots and can be often slippery when it's wet, those two soils can be very challenging to manage. And so often the ones that dry out really quickly are what we call our droughty soils, and we water a little bit extra. And our heavy clay soils are ones that often have problems with salt accumulation, and what we call sometimes our alkali soils, and often hold water really well in those soils. And again, adding a lot of organic matter can help balance that out. So organic matter really is our great equalizer when it comes to making a sandy soil hold water and nutrients better, or making a clay soil drain a little bit better and manage the salts a little bit better. So those are some things to think about. We do have a lot of salinity issues or salt issues around the state, and that's very common in arid areas. And that can also be an issue with water. And I know Jenny's going to share some resources, and including some more information on saline soils. But those are some of the additional challenges we have here in the state. And again, if you have some exceptionally challenging soils, putting in raised beds or using containers can be a great way to work around that.
Right. Just like behind Jeff's shoulder, right? Caitlin, if I'm new to gardening, how do I even tell what soil texture is? How do I tell a clay from a sand, from a silt, and that?
Sure. The simplest way to think about it is a sand feels gritty. It feels sandy. You can actually see the individual particles. A silt is going to be more like flour, soft, but more like a flour. And then a clay, of course, is going to be sticky, particularly, or pliable, sticky when it's wet. And most soils, all soils, in fact, are a combination of some of those three particle sizes, but they'll tend to be, a person may have more clay or more sand in their soil and have that noticeable, and that's going to affect somewhat their management strategies there. But again, adding organic matter and building up that organic matter, no matter what kind of soil you have, is going to be the single best thing you can do to make it easier to manage. And if you're really stumped or really need some more information on it, you can also, of course, contact your local extension office, and they can help you maybe identify your soil, put you in contact with somebody who can help.
We have a question. So we have a question from Ron Hutchinson. Excuse me. I've tried to make soil for my raised beds. I've used manure, peat moss, leaves. It resembles potting soil, but does not hold water very well, and the plants do not thrive. Should I add some clay?
No, typically a raised bed mix or a container mix often has sand in it to provide some structure, and then a lot of organic matter. And I'm not sure why yours are not holding water very well. Some of the raised beds we've constructed in the Warland Community Garden and filled with a compost mix similar to what you're describing. What I've noticed is that the organic material often, once it does dry out, it gets very hydrophobic and it doesn't hold water well until it gets wet. It takes a lot of water to get it wet, and once it gets wet, it holds water well. So I'm wondering, perhaps in your situation, if it just isn't getting wet to begin with, or you might consider adding some sand or something to give it some structure in there, or some soil, some just native soil that may have some sand or clay in it to give it a little bit of structure, and that may help. That would be my bet. Without seeing it, it's a little bit harder to answer that question.
Yeah, I think you're right, Caitlin. Sorry.
Sorry.
I think you're right, Caitlin. If you add, especially if that clay is really heavy, like especially as you get closer to like a bentonite clay, it just might hold too much for you and be basically a sticky mess within that raised bed, and then you have other issues than that. And it just might be, maybe you need to irrigate more often, more frequent, and keeping that bed hydrated. It may be a matter of time, right? So decomposition is microbially mediated, which means it's the bacteria and the fungal organisms mostly that are breaking down those leaves and peat moss and grass clippings right in that compost bed. And that activity needs a lot of water and warmer temperatures. And so the decomposition is going to happen mostly in the summer, right, when you're adding a lot of water. And what we've noticed also is that it just takes a lot of time. And so what starts out with a lot of maybe leaves and grass clippings and various other things, until they really start to break down and become more of a composted material, the water doesn't, it's not going to hold water very well. It's going to be like a pile of dry leaves or wood chips or something in there. So it may just be a matter of time where it's going to take another season or so for it to break down and become more of a compost that holds good water.
Can I share some of the things that I've done in my own garden back here? So as you can see, I have planting in the ground and I have raised beds. And what we did is our compost is, I've admitted to Caitlin many times, I'm a terrible composter. I'm maybe a passive aggressive composter. I don't know, but all of our compost is organically based. It's majority of leaves that I collect over a season or two or three, and some grass clippings, and because I'm a passive composter, it takes about 3 or 4 years before it actually becomes what I would consider to be usable. And what we did when we put this high tunnel in is we scooped on the half that's under the raised beds. I got to know which way to go. On the half that's under the raised beds, we scooped all of the topsoil off that was there, and underneath we have a heavy clay, that caliche clay, white stuff that when it crumbles it looks like cat litter kind of stuff. But I had 4 or 5 inches of topsoil that I was able to pull out and set up the raised beds. And then our native soil is 92% sand. So I was able to take our compost to about 25% at the time and mix it in and put it in with these raised beds and get them going. And then just this year we added more compost to it. So our intent is to continue to add compost to it, but it just, it's one of those timing things. Our raised beds are very productive. Our planting in ground is very productive. So it just depends on the conditions that you have and what you're trying to accomplish. And if you have the capability to start with some natural soil and add material to it, correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I kind of wonder too, getting back to that question, I was kind of reading it a little bit more, but he said he added some peat moss, and at least in my experience, if you get too heavy in that peat moss sphagnum type potting mix, I've seen that in containerized systems where that'll dry out and it'll just harden up, and you almost got to saturate and soak that to get water to infiltrate, like Caitlin was saying, with the hydrophobicness of it, until it gets saturated again. Then it'll porously pull that water in, and so he just might be a little heavy on that peat moss in that mix as well.
I've seen that.
I suspect just time for it to break down and decompose and turn from sort of your raw ingredients into a really nice compost mix.
Yep, I've seen that. And when you start seeds as well, those mixes are really high in peat moss as well. And so with those, what you have to do is you use warm water. There's something about the warm water that allows it to absorb, whereas the cold water will just roll right off it. We have one more question. It's from Annie. She asks, is the compost from local dumps okay, or is it usually very weedy?
That's a great question. That depends on who's making the compost. So the compost process that kills weeds and any potential pathogens that might be in the raw materials is heat. And so if the place you're getting your compost from has done a good job of getting a really good heat cycle on that compost, typically over 130 degrees, you should have no issue with weed seeds or potential other issues in your compost. And a really simple way to test for that is ask for a little sample and grow some, just plant it, water it up on your windowsill, maybe plant something in it, and see if weed seeds germinate and see how your vegetable seeds grow. And then that will tell you if you have good quality compost before you bring in maybe a truckload for your garden. That's just called a little bioassay. So take a little deli tray or some small plant pots, put them on your windowsill, plant some peas or beans in them because they're relatively sensitive plants to a potential contamination in the soil, see if they grow well, and then also see if any other seeds germinate that you didn't plant.
One of the issues with compost from a source that you haven't created, you don't know where those leaves and trees and whatever has come from and whether or not they've been treated with pesticides. So it's possible that some of the pesticides that are being used in turf that these compost materials end up starting from, the residual can be around long enough that it significantly will impact the growth of your plant. So the bioassay that Caitlin has mentioned is a really good idea to check out before you dump a whole bunch of this stuff into your system and find out, oh, I have a problem. My plants aren't growing correctly. They look kind of funky. So compost from a source that you don't know, you need to do a bioassay.
Well, and I'd like to just throw out there, when a lot of times what I see with clientele that I work with, they think they're getting compost, right? Maybe from an outside source, or maybe they're making their own compost. The way I think of it is a compost, it's not truly compost until you cannot identify those organic elements that are put into that compost, right? If you can still identify the wood, the leaves, it's not compost yet. It's not done. Is that right, Caitlin, or is that a better guidance?
That's certainly something to think about. So high quality. So your end use, it depends somewhat on your quality. So we are making some compost here with the city of Worland, and it's a very slow process, kind of a low-tech process. And when we give it away, what I'm really telling people is it's kind of composted mulch. It's not the kind of high quality compost you might want to incorporate into your soil, but it's a lot of basically aged and composted leaves that can be used as mulch on top of your soil. It's not the kind of compost I would use for making my own potting mix or seed starting mix, for example, or expecting to get a lot of nutrients out of it by incorporating it into the soil. It's more of a mulch material. Again, looking at how finished the compost is, can you identify the raw materials? Does it smell good, or does it still smell like manure? Has it gone through a heat cycle in order to kill those weed seeds that we talked about? So all those have to do with the quality of the compost. And again, it's a biological process, right? It takes time, it takes water, it takes oxygen to make that high quality product. But there's no reason not to use some aged manure if you're careful with how you handle it, or to use some of these kind of what some people might call leaf mold, or partially composted leaves or aged leaves as a mulch product, or some grass clippings. So there's lots of different ways to use the organic matter, even if it hasn't gone through a long compost process.
We have another question. It's kind of on well water with a lot of minerals on it and its effect in soils. Do you want to answer it now or later, Caitlin?
We can try. It's not my specialty, but let's give it a shot. Maybe other folks can chime in too.
Jeremiah might have an idea for that one.
Oh, yeah. So the question is from Tanya. She says, we have a fairly good garden established. However, we have problems with our water. We use well water and it has quite a salt/mineral content. We end up with white residue in the rows by the end of each season, as well as partially plugged soaker hoses. Is there a way to combat salt accumulation in the garden? Amend the soil more? Other treatments? Will regular rain and snowfall take care of it each season?
Boy, that's a great question. So the basic about salts is that a salt is a positive and negative ions that dissociate in water. So that could be table salt or sodium chloride. A lot of our fertilizers are also salts, so potassium nitrate, all those things. So basically when we have a salt accumulation in our soil, in most cases it means it's too much of a good thing, or it's too many plant nutrients that are accumulating and can't be used. And so it makes it hard on the plants. It's hard for them to grow, just like us trying to use salt water. It's hard for us to use, right? So the interesting thing in our climate is that we often have accumulation of salts in our soils, because as the sun hits the surface of the soil and heats it up, the water evaporates off the soil and it leaves the salts behind, like it does on your stove and the pot on your stove, right? And so that's where mulch, heavy mulch, can help a lot in terms of keeping that surface of the soil cool and reducing the evaporation of the clean waters, or the water, so to speak, and leaving the salts behind. So drip irrigation can help sometimes with that as well. And again, that organic matter in the soil can help bind up some of those salts, but especially keeping the soil mulched and reducing the bare soil where that sun hits and heats it up and evaporates the water out. When it comes to salt in the irrigation water, it's sometimes just the challenge we have to deal with. For folks who are dealing with really saline conditions, another thing you can think about is the types of crops you grow. There are certain crops that are more tolerant, or certain vegetables that are more tolerant to salts, and UW has a good bulletin on that with a good list of what you can grow. For example, broccoli is going to be more tolerant than peas, as an example. So you might choose your vegetable crops based on what your salt conditions are, and also seedlings are going to be much more sensitive than transplants. So again, you can use transplants instead of direct seeding as a way to manage some high salts in your soil. Do you have anything else you'd add, Jeremiah, in terms of the water side of things?
Yeah. So the water side of things, unfortunately, with Wyoming, we have that. That's pretty common in the area. How high calcium in our water, high salts in our waters, depending on where you're at, right? To remediate that and to clean up that water is really expensive. You're looking into filtration systems and things like that. And so it's usually not cost effective to clean the water. In terms of salt onto the soil, I would also just throw out there that it's also possibly a soil issue, right? So if wherever that garden is, especially if it's in natural soil, maybe there's a high level of clay and it's not allowing that water to drain properly, and we're keeping too much water on the soil surface, like Caitlin was talking about, and that sun has time to evaporate that, leaving those salts behind. So by adding compost, by adding organic matter, we can open up the drainage a little bit of those soils, and hopefully they'll drain better. Especially organic products or organic matter, especially like wood chips and mulching that way, they are very absorptive and they will absorb those salts into them. It doesn't get rid of the salt, right? It just binds that salt up, so hopefully you won't have salt injury to the garden.
So the other thing I noticed, Caitlin, is you're recommending different crops. The rule at our house is we only plant what we like to eat. If you don't like broccoli, you might be in trouble.
We don't plant broccoli at my house, Jeff.
You can send me the broccoli. I like broccoli. I'll take yours, Jeremiah.
It sounds good. So I have a question with compost and adding organic matter. Is there a certain time of year that we should be adding this? Is there a certain time of year that mulch is more appropriate than actually putting compost in the ground? Is it better in the fall, summer, spring? Is there a timing issue with that?
Yeah, you can add high quality compost anytime, but fall actually is the best. And we often think of spring as the time we get out, we get excited, we go get that truckload of compost and manure and put it in. But fall is actually the best time to do that. It gives that time for the microbial activity in the soil to kind of stabilize and work all winter, keeps the soil covered and protected. Really important to keep our soil covered in the winter. And while of course you can, if you're putting in a new garden this year and this is your first chance to do it, go out and get some compost or some aged manure. But really, ideally, you put it on in the fall and mulch really heavily year round.
So
I'll show you a picture actually of the garden in Worland and what it looks like. When it's all mulched.
So, Lynn, when you're saying adding compost and mulching, to me, compost needs to be incorporated and mulching just stays on top to preserve moisture and those types of things. So can you make some recommendations for what we should actually be doing with these different types of products?
Sure. Well, one nice thing is that Mother Nature's pretty forgiving, right? She has these, and so if you can however you can get that organic matter on there, if you can put it on as a mulch and let it work down slowly through the soil over time. If you want to put the compost on in the fall and just layer it onto the surface, and then in the spring with your shovel or your broad fork, work it in slowly into the top several inches of the soil profile, that's a good strategy. If you are the type that you might bring in a truckload of manure every few years, and then maybe you want to incorporate it with some minor amount of tillage at that point. There are a lot of different ways to do it. So compost can be used as a soil amendment, which means you'd incorporate it into the soil, and it can also be used as a mulch. And again, some of that's going to depend on how you're managing and also the type of compost that you have. This picture up that I have right now is the Worland Community Garden. And this last year we got a truckload of moldy alfalfa hay, which it makes wonderful garden mulch. If you can get your hands on some old alfalfa hay for free that somebody can't feed, that is about the best stuff you can get for the garden. Very low risk of weeds or herbicide contamination, high nutrients, a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in there, protects the soil, feeds the soil, makes great mulch, can be used for straw bale gardening. So I would really encourage you to try some of that. This is what we have here. And then just looking at what the soil looks like after pulling that mulch back, having been there all winter, and you can see the amount of life and biology in that soil. See that where that arrow is, the little earthworm castings there, and just the amount that just looks like really a living, healthy soil, something that a plant would want to grow in. So just encouraging you to keep your soil covered year round.
Yeah. So with that mulch, then I'm just trying to think through that process. Then that mulch, you've heavily mulched all summer, keeping that cover on that soil, right? And then in the fall, then that mulch, then do I need to remove that or do I need to work that in? Can that become part of my compost I worked in? How does that work?
So this is what this picture of the garden is what it looked like all fall and into the winter. So you just think about, instead of leaving your soil bare in the fall, and some people will even rototill in the fall after harvest, please don't do that. That is terrible for your soil. So think about tucking your soil in the fall under a cozy blanket, right? Think of all the worms will come up underneath there. All the microbes will be working all winter long, and it will hold any snow or any winter moisture we get will be held there in place. So just tuck everything in under a nice blanket. And then this picture here, this is just last weekend. We went out, we planted a few early spring crops just to see how they would do. On the left is what the mulch looked like. Pull that back, just pull it right off the bed. Get in there with the shovel, turn it gently, plant, and then put a real thin layer back over top. We planted some peas, and so I know that they're tough enough to push up through a thin layer of mulch. So we put that thin layer, a very thin layer back on top, and there's a lot of moisture left in that soil, and it was just beautiful. So that's how we managed the no-till beds in the Worland Community Garden. Now, depending on how much mulch you have and how thick it is, you may need to add more during the growing season. This coming year, we ended up with so much mulch this year, I think we won't have to add very much more, but if you do, you can use other things like straw makes great mulch, again, is always a good option. And what most people have is a lot of grass clippings, right? And again, be aware if you have recently treated your lawn with an herbicide or a weed and feed product, don't use those grass clippings or your neighbor's grass clippings, but they make a wonderful mulch and they break down pretty quickly, so you'll have to add a lot of those each year. You know, they don't last very long. Do a great job of protecting the soil and keeping the water in the soil and keeping the weeds down. This is one of my favorite pictures here. You can see on the left, we didn't mulch very heavily, we ran out. And on the right, we had plenty of mulch, and look at the weed difference, the little weeds coming up around the garlic on the left versus on the right. So just a reminder that mulch not only keeps the moisture in your soil and helps with salt issues, but it also does a great job in reducing the amount of weeding you have to do, which makes gardening more enjoyable for us all.
Well, so Caitlin, I'm sorry, Jeremiah, but Caitlin, the bottom line, I guess, is if you can avoid it, don't incorporate it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are ways to incorporate a little bit, especially if you feel like you need you need to incorporate some nutrients and you want an organic source of nutrients as opposed to a synthetic source of nutrients, and using something like a broad fork, right? I know you use these in your soil. Very simple tool, a shovel or a broad fork. So think of mixing, think of putting your soil in a blender if you're using a rototiller versus mixing something by hand, right? Being much more gentle on the biological system there. So using a broad fork and being able to just loosen up that soil, turn that soil a little bit, can help some of that compost kind of move down through the sewer. For example, this is some compost that comes out of Sheridan, like a yard waste compost. That's not going to blow around as much. It's denser, it's heavier. You can add a little moisture to it and hold it in place. So that is one thing that can work well. I think the straw and wood chips, of course, won't blow much if they're heavier wood chips. It's really important not to incorporate your wood chips into the soil because it will tie up some of your nitrogen short term, but it makes great mulch on the surface of the soil and can actually be used quite heavily if you have access to it, and it won't blow away either.
Yeah, for ornamental plantings, we use a lot of, around here, around Laramie, they have, they're called pole peelings, and so they're very shredded on the ends. They're like larger chunks of wood, but they're shredded on the ends. So they tend to knit together a little better, and so they stick down as a whole mat rather than being individual pieces which blow around. But the University of Wyoming this year, we're doing a little experiment at a couple of our research centers in Laramie with different types of mulches and seeing how they blow, more for the ornamental plantings. We have another question, but it has to do with nursery plants, and so I think we'll wait until after the break. As you might have noticed, Caitlin doesn't like recreational rototilling, and so we thought we had a little clip that you might enjoy if we shared it with you.
One of the most important decisions a gardener will ever make is where to locate their garden. And once you have that site selected, there's some things that you have to take into consideration. Whether the location is level, the amount of sunlight that location gets through the course of the day, and finally, what's the soil structure of that particular location. If you're not familiar with your soil type, the other thing that you probably need to do is submit a sample for analysis. And if you don't understand how to do that, please contact your local extension office. For this particular location, the things that we need to do in order to get this site prepared is we're going to have to level it out, take care of the weeds, and actually beside those things, the soil structure here is pretty good. I can get a shovel into the soil, get it turned over, and there's a wide variety of clods that are in this soil and ready to go. The one thing that we want to avoid at any location is destroying the soil profile through recreational rototilling.
Hello.
I'm Jeff Edwards, and this is the recreational rototiller for the University of Wyoming Extension from the ground up.
Oh always
was a
cracks
younger
me
version
up.
of me.
Well done, Hudson.
Yeah. So, recreational rototilling. We need to avoid doing that.
Please don't do it.
I have this conversation a lot with many people. I have to admit, I believe that my dad was a recreational rototiller because, you know, you had to either rototill it in the fall or rototill it in the spring, get that bed all ready to go before he planted. I have since changed my ways. So, Caitlin,
I'm glad to hear it, Jeff. I'm on a mission to get rid of all the rototillers in Washakie County. I think I have a few left to go.
if you don't get rid of them, you're going to sabotage them, right?
Yeah. You know, it takes a little bit of a change of aesthetic too, I think. You know, in the fall, we leave the garden pretty messy looking, which is also good for the insects, the pollinators that might live in there, the worms, all the critters in the soil. And when you come in the spring like I said, we planted a few early season crops the other day and pulled up some of the leftover pepper plants and some kale and a few things. And when you pull those up and look at the root balls, you'll be amazed how much life, and often they're full of worms and life in there too. And so just remember that it's a whole living system, and it doesn't need to be, it can be a little bit messy. Maybe think about changing your aesthetic a little bit. Or if you're a person that rototills 3 times a year, try just doing it twice a year or once a year. Or maybe just try a little section of your garden and start transitioning over slowly. If you can't go, cold
wean
turkey.
Wean yourself from the rototiller.
Yeah.
But some of us just really like power tools. Come
I
on.
know. Maybe you can find other power tools to play with instead.
Okay.
So here's a question from R. It's on a little bit on a broader gardening topic. It says, good morning. How well do plant starts or seedlings purchased from a nursery in a different state grow here in Wyoming? USDA hardiness zone there is different from ours. What days, quote unquote, range should we look for when we choosing varieties? Thank you.
So I can attempt to start on that one, and if somebody wants to finish for me, I'm okay with that. Again, Wyoming has very diverse climates, right? So if you're in Pinedale, the number of days that you have to grow is a whole lot significantly less than what we have in Torrington. And in Torrington, we're looking at about 110 days, 115 days of growth. Pinedale maybe only have 15 if you're lucky. So I think the majority of Wyoming is 4A, zone 4A. Torrington area, we're pretty close to 5. So it just kind of depends. If you're not familiar with the USDA zone maps, you can go online and take a look at where we're at and then compare what that information is on the packet.
Yes, our next webinar that we're going to have is actually going to be on choosing seed that'll do well for your area. So it's going to cover all that information on the USDA zones and how to choose plants that will really thrive where you're at.
So that individual needs to come back next time.
The other thing I just add to it, we're very much like you, Jeff. We're 4A. We might get away with some at 4B. 3A, 3B really are better for us. 5s just don't do well for us up here in by Cody and Powell up in that area. The other thing I guess I would look at in terms of specifically looking for garden plants is going to be looking for that day, that growing degree days, or your growing season, essentially, of how many days do you have actually to grow. And so those shorter days, like Jeff said, they're around 110 days. We're around 100. Just a half an hour from here up on Hart Mountain, they're more closer to 95 days. So it just depends on the elevation, where you're located, that kind of thing, in terms of selecting that. So the farther you get away from Wyoming, I think that nursery stock is not going to be as conducive for Wyoming.
Well, and I would like to plug our local producers, our local nurserymen here. They watch for that type of thing. So if you can buy your starts locally, they would probably perform better than something that you would buy online or from a catalog.
Right.
If you have a local supplier. We have another question, and it's from Kathleen Hennick, and excuse me anyone if I mispronounce your name. What about using old newspapers for weed prevention and keeping the soil moist?
Yes, newspaper and cardboard. I'm going to share this picture again here. This is a picture of making a garden bed over grass. This is actually at the Sheridan Community Garden, using cardboard and then compost to convert some grass into a new garden bed. Newspaper can also work as a biodegradable mulch. You just need much thicker layers. And water is key to getting this to break down and be biodegradable, and of course, so that's in time. But yes, newspaper can work well. I'm going to do some trials here shortly with actually using wool tags, which is the dirty part of the wool that sheep producers can't use, and use that as a mulch, which I think could work really well. I've heard people talk about using burlap. Of course, wood chips and pine needles are another thing. So there are a lot of different materials, but yes, newspaper and cardboard can work well. Take the tape off the cardboard.
Yeah. How about shredded paper? I mean,
shredded paper can work well. The challenge with it is when it dries out and blows away and makes a mess. But if you can manage that, or if you could use shredded paper, get it really wet, shred it, and then put something else on top of it, it could work really well. So that's certainly, it's another carbon source. It's a little less biologically active than something that was living more recently, but it still is a carbon source, and it can certainly still be used with some creativity. I would not use the shiny paper. Newspaper would be better. White office paper would work a little slower to break down. Newspaper would work better, and then of course cardboard, anything unbleached.
So when you say shiny paper, you're thinking like those magazine covers or a gloss on those, or photo paper or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We have another question. It's from Krista. Are biosolids from wastewater treatment plants safe for gardens?
Yes, they certainly can be, and that's a personal choice. I did a lot of my graduate research with biosolids compost, and we looked at pathogen breakdown and contaminant breakdown in them, antibiotics specifically. Compost actually does an amazing job of breaking down nearly all contaminants. Not 100%, but does a great job of breaking down a lot of contaminants and binding them up in the soil. So the plants can't get to them. And if you think about it, a lot of those contaminants are just another food source for all the bacteria and the fungi living in the compost. When you pick up biosolids compost from a compost yard, like a municipality, they are working really hard to make sure it goes through the appropriate heat cycle to kill any potential pathogens or weed seeds that might be in there. And so it should be a really high quality, clean product. That process is regulated by the EPA, actually. I would feel personally very comfortable with using a biosolids compost in my garden, but that is a very personal choice, and everyone has to make that one for themselves.
We have another one from Annie. She asks, will pine needles change the soil too much?
That's a really good question. We have very alkaline soils here, and so a little bit of acidity would be good for our soils. I do not know what the research says, if anybody's ever done research on how much the pine needles will change the pH of the soil, but I would be inclined to use them as mulch.
I've actually seen some research where the pine needles don't change the pH at all.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, so it's a thing that you can use and incorporate, and they'll break down just like anything else and won't change the pH.
Mm-hmm.
And if it did change that pH, it's going to be temporary. And so, you're going to need lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pine needles if you're going to make any change to that pH. But once that's degraded and you haven't added any more, that pH comes right back. So I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, but it's an organic source, right?
I'm going to show this picture really quick as another simple way to make compost at your own place. This could be used for grass clippings, leaves. These are wire hoops, some woven wire fencing or chicken wire. They're very lightweight. They're easy to use and move around. You can unhook them, unclip them, and empty them out, and then refill, turn your compost. You could put your pine needles in here, grass clippings. You could put some vegetable scraps, a little bit of manure, any combination of materials. Preferably layer your greens and browns if you have some different materials. This is working really well for us, and I've seen it work in a lot of really small spaces as well. Simple.
Caitlin, how big a diameter circle is this that you're showing us?
These are about probably 2 to 3 to 4 feet, depending on this one on the right. The green one is a lot smaller. The ones we have at the garden are probably closer to 3 feet.
So can you share typical use patterns? So I'm thinking, okay, I've got a bunch of leaves. I'm going to cram them in there. then what?
So they need water, right? So composting, it's a microbial process. The bacteria and the fungi need water, food, and air. So you're providing the food. In our dry climate, they need a lot of water, and these leaves are not going to absorb water very well until they start to break down, right? We build these in the fall. We turned them again just the other day in the spring. They still have a ways to go. We'll probably keep watering them all summer, and then use the one on the left that's mostly leaves. Use that this fall for mulch, probably, or maybe late summer. So it takes some time. The one on the right that has a lot of grass clippings in it, and if you and they're adding a little bit of vegetable scraps, I think it's going to break down a lot faster because it has a little more nitrogen in it. So you can really use it however you want. If you want it to be a lot faster, and you know you're pretty comfortable with compost, and you know what to add, you can take that and turn it every couple of weeks, and you'll get a much faster. You'll get to your end product much faster. Or you can just build them up and leave them for a season or a year and come back to them next year and have some nice leaf compost.
So when you say turn it, do you dump everything out of it?
Yeah,
Mix
so
it
you
up
dump
and
it,
then
you
put it back in?
you can either lift and pull the wire off, or if that doesn't work, you can just unhook the wire and kind of unfold it.
Okay.
And then set it to the side, and then get your shovel or your pitchfork, and then add some water and scoop it all back in again, and kind of mix it, aerate it, and add some water when you refill those bins.
Any
You
fear
can
of
do this in just a
spontaneous
pile,
combustion?
but this is really tidy and it works well. We have about 8 of them stacked along the fence, and it just is really tidy and keeps them contained, and it makes it easier for us to manage.
Any fear of spontaneous combustion?
No, not in this size.
Okay.
Do you got to add anything to it in terms of, like, do I need to add earthworms to it to try and help break it down
No, 'cause the
faster? Add
ground's open.
fertilizer?
No, so again, if you think about composting, you need the right balance of food. Those familiar and understand, you mix the greens and the browns, or you mix your carbons and your nitrogen products. The one on the right is mostly grass clippings. The one on the left is mostly leaves. In a perfect world, you'd actually have those two combined and have kind of a nice combination of both. Or again, vegetable scraps, food scraps can be a nice addition. Coffee grounds are great. Pick up your coffee grounds from a local coffee shop, gas station, espresso stand. Coffee grounds add a nice nitrogen to the leaves, and there's no issue with odors or pests or anything. So that works really well. We've added a lot of coffee grounds to these. Vegetables, maybe after the first frost in the garden, you'll have a lot of tomatoes or things that didn't get harvested. Those could go in there. Any combination of different organic materials. Manures could also be added.
I had a horticulturist that I worked with that suggested using composted chicken manure to kind of fire things up and get it cooking, and it works really well.
It does. Very high nitrogen, very high phosphorus. Would be great in adding some of these leaves. These leaves are just very high in carbon and low in nitrogen, so they're very slow to compost on their own. So anything you add that has nitrogen, that could be a chicken manure, food scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, that will speed up the process and make a more nutrient-dense compost.
We're getting some great questions. There's a couple more that have come in. I'm going to combine 2 of them. One's from Krista and one's from Miriam. Is it better to avoid using treated wood around one's compost bin? And the second question is, thoughts on biochar and azomite to amend soil? Thanks.
Oh, good ones. Do you have any thoughts on treated lumber, Jeff?
I do. So treated lumber used to be arsenic based. They've removed all of that arsenic product from treated lumber, and it's more it's less toxic, I guess, the material that they're using in treated lumber now than what it used to be historically. The beds that you can see behind me, that is not pressure treated lumber. That's actually a recycled plastic biocomposite product that came from Torrington, Wyoming plant. There are certain instances where you have to use treated lumber. It will last longer than just straight lumber or painted lumber, or if you're concerned about it, you can create beds out of pressure treated lumber and then line that with a plastic product that kind of prevents a barrier between the soil and between the lumber so that things don't eke into it. Just be careful, I guess. I think I would rather use treated lumber than a creosote packed railroad tie.
Right. Or you could go with like redwood, right? So
Right.
as it's
Yeah.
natural, it's slower to break down, slower to decompose than a normal wood, but it's not been treated, right? So if you wanted to get away from a treated board.
And cedar's the same way, except cedar
Right.
isn't very structurally sound as far as screwing things together. It's too soft of a wood to be a structural type of product for a raised bed. So there are some options out there. You just need to kind of look around. I see people making raised beds out of tin or metal siding that look really sharp. You know, they're going to last longer than straight.
When you say sharp, you mean it looks good, not that it's
well, they can be sharp
right?
too. They can cut you. Wear gloves.
Yeah. At least from my perspective, it's kind of just a personal preference, right? If you're concerned about it, try and find all alternatives.
I think there's the research suggests that a lot of that material that's in treated lumber and the creosote doesn't travel through the soil. But you know, it's your preference, and you have to make up your mind what you're going to do.
Right.
So the other one was thoughts on biochar and azomite to amend the soil.
Good question. I don't know a lot about azomite, so I'm not going to answer. I would have to do my own research on that, and I do not know much about that, so I can't answer that question. I know the biochar is getting a lot of more interest these days. It has a lot of potential. There's a lot more research that still need to be done. The two places with the most potential I think I've seen here is helping manage salts a little bit and actually helping manage herbicide contamination in the soil. There's not been a lot of research, I don't think, but I've seen it here in a couple of gardens where people have tried it, and it seems to have helped where they've had some herbicide contamination either from some bad compost or grass clippings. Again, it's anecdotal at this point, but it seems to maybe help bind up those contaminants in the soil and make them unavailable to the plants. And then potentially, what it does basically is it greatly increases binding sites in the soil. And the clay typically provides binding sites in the soil for nutrients, which include salts and also for contaminants. And so by adding biochar, one thing it can do is greatly increase those binding sites. While it is a carbon source, it's not very biologically active anymore. So when you add a manure or a grass clipping compost or some sort of recently alive product, it's very biologically active, and the microbes are going to continue to break it down. Biochar is not a biologically active carbon. And so it does different things in the soil than adding, for example, compost or manure.
We have a really good question from Tonis. Again, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name. It says, we are planning a first-year garden. If you could pick your top 3 musts for soil prep, what would they be?
That's a great question. So I don't know what type of soil you have, and if you have soil that you can plant into, or if you're needing to go up with your soil amendment. So here, one thing I would encourage you to do is something like this potentially, where if you have pretty good soil, maybe you're taking out some lawn, you can actually just go right on top of that lawn with some cardboard and compost potentially, or something like this, which is where you're basically building the soil up as opposed to going down into the soil, if that makes sense. So that's one good option. The challenge with this is that this takes a lot of time, and so it's really better to start with this sort of lasagna gardening or sheet mulching in the fall if you can. Unless you can get a lot of really high quality compost, then you can almost build an instant garden bed right there on top of the soil or on top of the existing lawn. The other option is to start with like some straw bales. This can be a great way to start in a small space, especially, or if you have really problematic soils, or it feels like your garden patch might just look more like a parking lot, like a gravel patch. Using something like these straw bales, getting a first year of growing a few of your favorite crops, and then these make beautiful mulch and can then be used to help amend the soil going forward. So that's a couple of options. Bringing in a lot of organic matter is going to be key. And then if you are going to be incorporating some organic matter into the soil, using something like a broad fork instead of a rototiller. So just don't save your money, don't go down the road of the rototiller, bring in some organic matter. And if you need some time to amend your garden and you want to do the sheet mulching and you want to give yourself a full season, maybe start with some containers or some straw bales this year. Lay out your garden, lay out your no-till beds, figure out where you're going to go, start accumulating organic matter all summer, start mulching it, layering it, adding lots of water, building that soil. And then next spring, you'll have several beautiful garden beds ready to go. And then this summer, use something like your straw bale garden and some container garden space to get you through the first season. That might be a way to approach it.
So a lot of our folks in Extension, we recommend that folks go out and get a soil test if they're just beginning and they haven't grown something in that area before. They provide a lot of information on those soil tests that are really useful in knowing what you need to add to it. Do you have any comments on that, Caitlin?
Yeah, that can certainly be helpful. I think there's a few reasons to do a soil test. One is if you're just curious and you just want to know what's there. One is if you've had some problems in the past and you're trying to diagnose why your plants are struggling and you can't figure it out, and so a soil test can help with that. Or if you're going to invest a lot of time and resources into a new garden or a new landscape project, like Jenny was saying, it can really help to spend a little bit on a soil test. It may be if you're a new gardener, you may find it worthwhile to ask for the additional texture analysis, which costs a little bit extra and you have to request it. But it can tell you if you have a sandy clay loam or a clay loam or whatever it is that you have. Might be of interest to you. Be sure you get a test for salts, and then of course you can get your baseline nutrient levels tested as well.
Things I would throw in there are the top 3 things that I would look at doing. All of Caitlin's suggestions are perfect, spot on. If you can do that, that works. The big thing I think of is we need to loosen that soil up. Either with a broad fork or a shovel, just turning that soil, getting that soil bed prepped and ready, loosened up, not big clods of dirt, but loosening it. Yep, thank you, Caitlin. So it's ready to accept seeds if you're going to do that, or transplants. The other things is I'd be looking into weeds, right? So I'd be pulling weeds, trying to remove any undesirable vegetation in that garden spot, so I can put my plants in there and they don't have to compete. Those are the other 2 things I just add to Caitlin's great suggestions.
Yeah, weeds for sure.
Yeah.
And get ahead of them. It's really worth the time to get ahead of the weeds, because once they start going to seed, oh my gosh, it takes the fun out of gardening really fast. And there are a few that will particularly spread with tillage. I didn't mention this earlier, but bindweed and thistle, Canada thistle, both will spread with tillage. And so that's another good reason to reduce the soil.
It chops them up into tiny little pieces, and each tiny little piece becomes a new plant that you get to deal with. So we have another good question from Krista. She says, last year's dead plants, tomatoes, peppers, etc., are still in my garden beds. Should I pull them out or just cut them off at the top of the soil?
That's a great question. I would encourage you to just cut them off at the top of the soil, honestly, unless they're in your way. So you can see in this picture here of our garden with our winter mulch, you can see in the back, sort of along the fence line, you'll see some old kale and pepper plants and various things that were just left through the winter. And then when we went and prepped some beds just the other day, we were planting peas, and there were a few things and they were kind of in the way, like right in the row where I wanted to plant. So I pulled them out. It depends on what you're planting and if they're in your way or not. If you want to just cut them off and leave them and they're not in your way, that's great. And it's that much more activity and biology that's going to be left in the soil. And they also leave root channels and let air and water circulate or percolate through the soil. And if they're in your way, just pull them out. That's fine too.
They can be a weed source, if you will, right? So if there was some fruit that wasn't harvested or any produce that wasn't harvested, that those seeds could be viable. And if you just leave them there, they can possibly germinate. And if you don't want them there, right, they're an undesired plant in that spot, they could then become a weed in that spot. But I think that's a minimal risk or concern, but it can easily be managed.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that I get about people starting new gardens is, how much time does it actually take to garden? if I have a hoop house or something enclosed like this, how much extra work is it? Initially, there's a little bit more work setting it up and all those types of things. But in all reality, our hoop house that I have behind us is 15 by 30. Excuse me, it's a 30 by 30 space. And generally, once a week, I will go in and weed the whole thing. It takes about an hour, maybe half an hour. But over time, this has been in production for about 4 years now. And the more you're in there taking care of issues, the fewer issues you have going forward. So the image that Caitlin showed of the broad forking there, that we didn't pull any weeds. That's what it was. So there wasn't any issues going forward.
And to your answer or your question, Jeff, or that statement of, I think you can put as little or as much time into gardening as you want, right? So I am kind of on the low end of effort into gardening because we like to recreate. We like to get out hiking, camping, fishing, and I don't want to be tied to that garden, but we still plant.
And you don't like broccoli, we already found out.
Right,
so.
Right. So plant easy plants too.
And mulch, heavy mulch is going to make a big difference in weeding, particularly if you're starting out as a new gardener and you want to get ahead of the weeds. Heavy mulch, and it's also going to save you a lot on the watering.
I'll second that. We have another question on soil testing, and before we do it, I just want to say for those of you who haven't done it, it's super easy. You can just dig out samples in whatever area you're interested, dry them out, put them in a Ziploc bag, put them in one of those little boxes that the post office have that are prepaid, ship them off to the lab. So I sent mine to CSU, and within like a week, they had emailed me the results on it. So there's other labs you can send them around the state. Tanya asks, if I can ask another question, we have a 40 by 100 foot garden. Should we get several soil samples in different areas? Our garden does seem to have different areas that prefer different vegetables. I've been wanting to get soil samples for a few years now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So she brings up a good point that sometimes you want to do what's called zone sampling. And really you want to do that for two reasons. One, your soil behaves really differently in different zones. Maybe you have a section that's really sandy or a section that's higher in clay or low, or maybe you have something kind of it's on a slope and you have top and the bottom of the slope. The other reason to do different samples is if you're going to managing those areas really differently. Maybe you have a pasture compared to the garden or something like that. So if you're really curious and it's something you've always wanted to do and you don't mind the extra expense of doing a couple of different samples, then yes, go for it and do some zone sampling. If everything's pretty similar in your garden and everything has been managed pretty similarly over the years and you have a similar soil type, then you can get away with doing what's called a composite sample. So you would go and take about 10 or so samples from across the garden and mix them all up together, take out about 2 cups worth, dry that down, like Jenny said, and send it into the lab. It's really important not to just send in just go put one sample and send it in because anything, one thing had happened in that spot or it's not representative of the whole garden.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a lot of soil, right? We don't need a 5-gallon bucket going off to the soil lab or a gallon Ziploc bag, right? Yeah. 2 cups.
No,
yep.
And it wasn't very
per sample.
It wasn't very expensive either. So I think I paid like $25 or $30 to get